The year is 1984, and fresh off of the success of his 1982 film Poltergeist, Tobe Hooper walks into the offices of Canon Pictures and strikes an unprecedented three-picture deal. That deal included The Texas Chainsaw Massacre Part 2, a remake of the classic science fiction film Invaders from Mars, and an adaptation of the 1976 Colin Wilson novel The Space Vampires, to be called The Space Vampires, later changed to Lifeforce. Lifeforce was positioned to be a successor in many respects to Hooper's Poltergeist, by way of the science fiction galactic operatic epic space drama of Star Wars. However, one thing that Canon Pictures didn't really bank on was that Hooper is a bit of a loose cannon. And that doesn't mean detrimentally so. That just means that the man is a bit wild. He's got a southern fried gonzo Texas wit that worms its way into basically everything he does. If you look at the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and its spastic behavior, that very same outlook is pretty much evidenced in almost everything the man has ever done. The follow-up film to Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the follow-up horror film, was Eaten Alive, which is probably even more deranged than the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Even Salem's Lot, as controlled a TV production as it was and chained to the source novel of Stephen King, still had these moments of really bizarre eccentricity and terror and weirdness that make it so wonderful, and probably one of the scariest vampire films ever made, period. But later on, his movies would always prove to be a bit bizarre and crazy, and no matter what he did, there'd always be the hallmark of Hooper's weirdness in there. Now, Poltergeist was probably the most conventional movie he'd ever made, but that's because, really, it was co-produced, co-written, and if you believe the hype, co-directed by Steven Spielberg, and it feels like a Spielberg film, with maybe a little bit more edge. So that's what Canon Pictures, Menachem Golem, and Yoram Globus wanted out of Hooper. They wanted a post-Poltergeist film, and instead they got what would be Lifeforce, one of the craziest, most ballistic, bizarre movies I've ever seen, and probably you've ever seen, and also one of the most incredible and apocalyptic horror films ever made. A movie that kind of got a bad rap when it came out because it was just too much. It was too outlandish. It was too crazy. A movie that was marketed poorly, as Hooper himself would proclaim later to me and to others. If it was just called The Space Vampires, if it was just released under its shooting title, then it would have found its audience. But Lifeforce really, upon release, never really did find its audience, and critics were confused. Leonard Maltin famously gave the movie kind of a weird backwards rave review, mentioning that everything but the kitchen sink was thrown in and how fascinating and fun and energetic it was, and yet he still only gave it 2 stars and pretty much a poor review on his Entertainment Tonight spot as well. And that was pretty much the consensus across the board. No one hated the film. People were just almost afraid to say that they liked it because it was just too weird. But there's so much going on in Lifeforce. In fact, I think that outside of Chainsaw Massacre, it may be Hooper's best film. It's certainly his bravest and his most ambitious. So much there, so much opulence, so much operatic weirdness that it can never be dismissed, and anyone who does has got their head screwed on wrong. Chief among the movie's powerful elements, not only its cast, Steve Railsback, Peter Firth, Matilda May as the gorgeous nude space vampiress, is the music, and also the history behind that music. Now, ostensibly, composer Henry Mancini was hired to score the movie. Now, Henry Mancini being the guy that, well, he wrote Moon River, for crying out loud, who had worked not exclusively, but extensively with Blake Edwards in films like Breakfast at Tiffany's and, of course, all the Pink Panther films. Did not seem like the ideal choice to score a, erotic science fiction epic. But he had done some 50s sci-fi, including It Came from Outer Space, so he knew the beat, and certainly a guy like Mancini could adapt to any canvas. And he relished the idea of taking on this giant space opera. And his music, when delivered, was exactly what Hooper wanted, and exactly what Golan and Globus wanted too. It was a John Williams-esque, majestic score with a full orchestra and a choir, and really made the movie seem even larger than life than it was, really. Now, Hooper's cut was over 2 hours long, and when delivered to the distributor in the United States, they said it's too long for a horror film. It's too long for a movie like this. We gotta hack this fucker down, and so they did. Hack away. Mancini was aghast. They decimated the entire opening sequence and lost his incredible overture, the Lifeforce theme, dumped that on the back end of the movie. It only appears in the American cut at the very end of the film. And they altered the opening to make it more of a horror film, less of a science fiction movie, more of an overt zombie vampire horror movie. So the American cut of the movie, Mancini wasn't around to come on board and do that score, and he had already signed up to do Santa Claus the movie of all things, so he couldn't come back and fix the edit and redo some of the opening music. So he was off the project. So they hired Michael Kamen, who I guess at that point was probably most famous for working with Terry Gilliam on the movie Brazil, to come in and make a score that was more akin to the Alien score, something a little more atonal, a little more ambient, a little more terrifying. And boy, did he deliver. Your point of entry depends on when you get on the train, and for me, the first version of Lifeforce I ever saw was on cable, and it was the American TriStar Columbia cut. And I was mesmerized and terrified. The opening has a kind of layered, dissolved, impressionistic feel. As Colonel Carlson, who's hypnotized by the vampires and sucked into the alien Batwing spaceship, he falls under their spell and kind of enters a state of delirium. So does the audience with Kamen's music. It's ambient and strange and synthesizer-based, although there is some orchestral sting in there. And it just makes you feel like you're falling under this kind of woozy, drunken spell of these nude creatures, specifically, again, of course, the majestic Matilda May. And you feel like you're right there with them, lost in this horrifying spaceship. There's really quite nothing like it. And I'm not going to say it's better than Mancini's music, but certainly it changes the context of the film. And that happens throughout the movie. Kamen also came in and did some little stings here and there when the vampires wake up in London. He changed some of the music there too. The movie itself was re-edited, and some scenes of the zombie apocalypse were cut and filtered out through other parts of the movie so that we kind of foreshadow the terror that is to come. And if you watch the American cut, it is a pure horror film, as opposed to the original cut. It was released in Europe, which is more akin to a science fiction film with horror elements. The American cut, which is a little bit shorter, is a full-blown horror movie. So both scores are relevant and both scores are beautiful, but both scores, when applied to the movie, create a radically different motion picture experience. And I don't think that any other score out there, really, any other film, really proves and exemplifies the fact that music is perhaps the most powerful element in cinema, really dictating how you feel. Forget dialogue, forget lighting, forget editing, forget everything else. It's sound and fury and music that really draws you in and makes you emotionally and viscerally respond to an image. Now, if you're interested in exploring this, Scream Factory put out a fantastic Blu-ray release a couple of years ago, which included both cuts of the film. Originally, the American cut was very hard to find. It was released by Vestron Pictures, Vestron VHS in the 80s, a version I still have, signed by Hooper. But other than that, it was very difficult to get your hands on. There's a 35 millimeter print out there, so if you were lucky enough to screen that print, it was the American cut, which I have done. And again, to see the movie theatrically, that version is like no other experience. However, Scream Factory restored and represented that version as well as the original long European cut. Both are there. And the scores are both available, although the soundtrack is long out of print, via BSX Records. It's a double CD, and both scores are there. Mancini's full score as well as all the Kamen cues, and you can experience them isolated, which is interesting because obviously Mancini's score isolated, it goes without saying, is the superior score. But when applied to the film, it's the inferior score, in my opinion. Now, Hooper's take on either cut of the film depends on what day of the week, I guess, you speak to him. When I spoke to him years ago, he told me he preferred the American cut, like me. Perhaps he was just being agreeable. However, on the commentary track for the new Scream Factory release, he says the opposite. He prefers the European cut. Both versions have value, and both versions are a piece of an amazing puzzle for a film that really came out probably way ahead of its time, and really shouldn't have been made at all, especially with this director, but was, and was financed and produced by two of the craziest producers and filmmakers in the 1980s, Golan and Globus Canon Pictures, at their peak. Hooper told me that he literally just went into the office and said, "Hey, I want to make this movie." And they said, "Okay, Toby, here's your money." and they just give him money. So those days are done. They're over. That's finished. And certainly Lifeforce bears the mark of eccentricities and excess, and God bless it for that.